The gas station glowed under the sodium hum of a single flickering light, its pale beams slicing through the humid dusk of a southern summer. John Miller stood by pump 3, his calloused hands steady as he replaced the nozzle, the faint scent of gasoline clinging to his faded denim jacket. His boots, polished but worn, rooted him to the cracked asphalt, each scuff a testament to decades of measured steps. At 66, his frame was lean, his posture rigid, as if gravity itself could not bend the steel of his spine. The evening was quiet, save for the distant chirp of crickets and the occasional rumble of a pickup truck rolling past on Main Street. Then came the screech of tires. A silver sedan swerved into the lot, its driver, a man in his 30s, face flushed with entitlement, leaping out before the engine had fully settled. He strode toward John, his voice sharp, accusing, slicing through the stillness. "You cut me off, old man. Think you own the damn road?" John turned slowly, his gray eyes meeting the younger man's with a calm that seemed to deepen the other's rage. He said nothing, his silence a wall, unyielding. The man stepped closer, chest puffed, finger jabbing. "Say something, or I'll make you." John's gaze never wavered, but his right hand twitched, an instinct buried deep, born in deserts, where hesitation meant death. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, and turned back to his truck. That was when the man grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around. The air crackled with tension, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. John's voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, a gravelly whisper. "You do not want this fight." The man froze, then stumbled back, his bravado crumbling under the weight of something he could not name. Within minutes, sirens wailed. Red and blue lights bathed the lot, and 2 officers approached, their hands resting on holsters. "John Miller, you're under arrest," one said, his tone clipped, professional. The cuffs clicked shut, cold steel biting into John's wrists. He did not resist, did not speak, did not even glance at the crowd now gathering, locals drawn by the spectacle, their whispers weaving a narrative of an angry veteran, unhinged, dangerous. John's face remained a mask, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeing something beyond the flashing lights, beyond the town itself. The officers led him to the patrol car, and as the door slammed shut, the man from the sedan clutched his neck, already rehearsing his story. The courthouse stood at the heart of Edenville, a 2-story brick relic squeezed between a library with peeling paint and a dentist's office that smelled faintly of mint. Its wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, their murmurs filling the air like static. It was the 3rd day of John Miller's trial, and the room buzzed with the casual cruelty of small-town gossip. "Heard he threatened to shoot that guy," one woman hissed, her pearls glinting under fluorescent lights. "PTSD, probably," a man replied, adjusting his tie. The bailiff, a burly man named Tom, shifted uncomfortably as he escorted John to the defense table. Something about the old man's silence, his unblinking stare, made Tom's skin prickle, though he could not say why. John sat, hands folded, cuffs glinting in the morning light that streamed through high windows. His public defender, Sarah Klein, barely glanced up from her notes, her glasses slipping down her nose as she scribbled. She had tried to talk to him once in the holding cell. "You have to give me something, John." "Anything." He had only looked at her, his eyes heavy with a story she could not read, and said, "Do your job." Now, she shuffled papers, her sighs audible, as the prosecutor, David Reese, strutted before the jury, his suit crisp, his smile practiced. Reese saw this case as a stepping stone, a chance to prove his mettle. John Miller was just a name on a file, a means to an end. The judge, Margaret Holt, entered, her robe swishing as the room stood. She was fair but tired, her patience worn thin by years of petty disputes. She called the court to order, her voice steady, but laced with the weight of routine. As the first witness, a gas station clerk with nervous hands, took the stand, John's gaze drifted to the window where a cardinal perched on a sill, its red feathers a fleeting spark against the gray. He thought of mornings in his trailer, the wooded lot at Edenville's edge where he lived alone. No internet, no mailbox, just the rhythm of dawn walks and the ghosts he carried. The clerk's voice droned on, describing John's aggressive stance. But John was elsewhere, in a memory of sand and blood, of a rifle's weight in his hands, of a single shot that changed everything. Back then, he had been Gunnery Sergeant John Miller, a Marine sniper whose precision was legend. Fallujah, 1994. A crumbling wall, a pinned unit, a rooftop hatch at 936 yards, one shot, crosswind, moving target. He had not missed. He never did. But that was a lifetime ago. Before the medals he never claimed. Before the silence he chose over praise. Now the courtroom saw only an old man, stubborn, broken, a relic of a war no one cared to remember. The clerk stepped down, and Reese's voice rose, sharp, accusing. "This man thinks his past gives him a free pass to intimidate." John's lips twitched, not in anger, but in something closer to pity. Outside, the parking lot baked under the June sun, half full with sedans and news vans. Reporters lingered near the courthouse steps, sensing a story, but not yet its shape. In the woods beyond town, John's trailer stood silent, its windows dark, its walls holding secrets no one had bothered to ask. And somewhere, miles away, a black SUV rolled toward Edenville, its occupant a man whose collar bore 4 silver stars, a man who knew the truth about John Miller, a man who could not stay silent. The courtroom air hung heavy with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind of stillness that amplifies every creak of a bench, every rustle of paper. John Miller sat at the defense table, his hands folded, the cuffs now removed, but their weight still lingering in the faint red marks on his wrists. His gray eyes traced the grain of the table, as if it held answers the room could not provide. The jury, 12 strangers, their faces a mix of boredom and judgment, settled into their seats, unaware of the man they were about to condemn. Outside, the Edenville sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, where dust motes danced in slanted beams. David Reese, the prosecutor, stood before the jury, his voice smooth, practiced, a blade cloaked in velvet. At 35, he was ambitious, his sights set on a bigger office, a bigger town. This case, a simple misdemeanor, was his chance to prove he could command a room. He adjusted his tie, a flash of crimson against his charcoal suit, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, John Miller may have worn a uniform once, but that was decades ago. What stands before you now is a man who believes his past entitles him to threaten, to intimidate." His words landed with precision, each one a stone adding weight to the narrative he wove. John as a relic, unstable, dangerous. A few jurors nodded, their lips tight, already convinced. Reese called his first witness, the man from the gas station, Ethan Cole. Cole swaggered to the stand, his neck brace a theatrical prop, its Velcro edges fraying. He was broad-shouldered, his face tanned from weekends on the lake, his eyes darting to the jury for approval. Under oath, he recounted the altercation, his voice loud, rehearsed. "He looked at me like he wanted to kill me," Cole said, leaning forward, his hands gripping the stand. "Said he could end me from 800 yards without blinking," the courtroom murmured, a ripple of unease spreading. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Military types, always trouble." Reese let the moment linger, his smile faint but triumphant. John's face remained still, a mask carved from years of discipline. He did not flinch at Cole's words, did not correct the lie. His silence was not defiance, but exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness from a world that saw only what it wanted. Beside him, Sarah Klein, his public defender, scribbled notes, her pen scratching louder than necessary. At 29, Sarah was overworked, her desk buried under case files, her confidence eroded by clients who rarely spoke. She had tried to reach John, to coax a defense from him, but his silence had left her grasping. Now, she avoided his gaze, her fingers tapping nervously as Reese pressed Cole for details. "And how did you feel, Mr. Cole, when he made that threat?" Reese asked, his tone dripping with concern. "Scared for my life," Cole replied, his voice breaking for effect, though his eyes gleamed with something closer to satisfaction. The jury leaned forward, captivated by the performance. Sarah stood, her objection half-hearted. "Speculation, Your Honor." "The witness is exaggerating." Judge Margaret Holt, her expression unreadable, waved a hand. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Reese." Sarah sank back into her chair, her cheeks flushing, her doubt in John hardening into resentment. She glanced at him, expecting a reaction, but John's eyes were elsewhere, fixed on a crack in the ceiling, as if it led to a memory only he could see. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. Fallujah, 1994. The air thick with dust, the heat pressing against his skin like a living thing. John crouched behind a shattered wall, his rifle steady, his breath slow. Through his scope, a rooftop hatch, 936 yards away, a target moving in the crosswind. One shot. One life ended to save others. The recoil had been a heartbeat, the silence that followed a lifetime. He had not spoken then, either, slipping away before the unit could thank him. That was who he was. A shadow, a ghost, a man who carried the weight of his actions alone. Back in the courtroom, Reese called a second witness, a gas station clerk named Lily Harper. She was slight, her hands twisting in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "He didn't say much," she admitted, glancing at John with a mix of pity and fear. "But his body language, it was aggressive. Like he was ready to fight." Reese nodded, encouraging her. "And did you hear anything specific, Ms. Harper?" Lily hesitated, then said, "I heard him mutter something about knowing how to kill." The gallery gasped, the sound sharp, like a match struck in the dark. Reese turned to the jury, his expression grave. "Knowing how to kill." Words from a man who claims to be harmless. John's lips twitched, not in anger but in irony. He had never said those words, but he knew why they stuck. People saw the boots, the posture, the scars on his knuckles, and they wrote their own story. He could have spoken, could have told them who he was. But what would it change? The world had made up its mind long before he stepped into this room. Sarah leaned toward him, her voice low, urgent. "John, you have to give me something." "They're burying you." He met her eyes, his gaze steady, and said, "Let them." Sarah pulled back, her frustration boiling over, her pen snapping in her hand. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with activity. Reporters adjusted cameras, their lenses trained on the double doors, sensing a story, but not its depth. A few locals lingered, their conversations a mix of curiosity and disdain. "He's just some old vet who never moved on," one said, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Probably snapped," another replied, scrolling through his phone. Unnoticed, a group of men gathered at the edge of the parking lot, their faces weathered, their postures straight despite age. Veterans, men who had served with John decades ago, drawn by a text, a rumor, a gut feeling that something was wrong. They did not speak, did not need to. Their presence was a silent vow. Inside, Reese wrapped up his questioning, his closing statement looming like a storm cloud. He paced before the jury, his voice rising. This man lives in the shadow of a uniform he no longer wears. He thinks he can scare people, threaten them, because of who he used to be. That's not justice. That's danger. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Judge Holt adjusted her glasses, her face unreadable, but her fingers tightened around her gavel, a sign of unease she could not hide. The jury scribbled notes, their expressions hardening, the weight of Reese's narrative settling over them. John sat motionless, his breath even, his mind drifting to the trailer at the edge of Edenville's woods. The quiet of dawn, the creak of his porch, the solitude that had become his refuge. He had chosen that life, not out of bitterness, but necessity, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. Now those ghosts were here, in the courtroom, in the eyes of strangers who saw only a threat. He did not fear their judgment. He feared what it meant, that the world he had fought for had forgotten what sacrifice looked like. As Reese sat, smug, Sarah rose, her voice unsteady. "The defense will call no witnesses at this time," she said, the words a surrender. The gallery whispered, their judgment sharp. John's silence, once a mystery, was now a noose. Judge Holt leaned forward, her voice measured. "Mr. Miller, do you wish to speak on your behalf?" John lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Then he shook his head, slow, deliberate. The judge sighed, her gavel poised, the trial barreling toward its end. But outside, a black SUV rolled into the parking lot, its tires crunching gravel, its presence unnoticed by the reporters or the gossiping locals. The man inside wore a crisp uniform, 4 silver stars glinting on his collar. General William Carter, retired Chief of Special Operations Command, stepped out, his face set, his purpose absolute. He was not here to spectate. He was here to rewrite the story no one else could tell. The Edenville courthouse pulsed with the low hum of anticipation, its walls absorbing the weight of whispered judgments and half-formed truths. The morning sun had given way to a heavy noon, the light filtering through high windows in pale, unforgiving shafts. John Miller sat at the defense table, his hands still, his gray eyes tracing the faint scratches on the wooden surface, each mark a silent tally of cases come and gone. The jury, now accustomed to the rhythm of the trial, shifted in their seats, their notebooks filled with notes that painted John as a threat, a relic, a man unmoored. The air was thick with the scent of ink and sweat, the kind of stillness that precedes a verdict. Outside, the parking lot simmered under the June heat, the asphalt radiating waves that distorted the shapes of news vans and sedans. Reporters clustered near the courthouse steps, their voices a low buzz, their cameras trained on the double doors as if expecting a revelation. Locals lingered, their conversations sharp with speculation. "Heard he lives out in the woods. No phone, no nothing," one man said, his cap pulled low. "Crazy if you ask me," a woman replied, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. Their words drifted like smoke, weaving a narrative of John as an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of their tidy town. No one noticed the group of men gathering at the lot's far end, their faces lined with age, their postures straight despite the years. Veterans, 6 in number, their boots scuffed but deliberate, their eyes fixed on the courthouse. They had not been summoned, had not been invited. They came because a text, a whisper, a shared memory had told them John Miller was in trouble. Inside, the trial pressed forward, its momentum relentless. David Reese, the prosecutor, leaned against his table, his confidence a polished blade. He had finished with his witnesses, their testimony a carefully constructed cage around John's silence. Now he prepared his closing, his eyes flicking to the jury, reading their faces, sensing victory. Across the room, Sarah Klein, the public defender, typed aimlessly on her laptop, her frustration a palpable heat. She had given up on John, her questions unanswered, his silence a wall she could not breach. She glanced at him, her lips tight, as if his refusal to speak was a personal betrayal. John met her gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable, then looked away, his thoughts drifting to a place no one in the room could follow. The memory came sharp, unbidden, a fragment of a life he had buried. Fallujah, 1994. The desert air burned his lungs, the weight of his rifle a steady anchor. He lay prone on a rooftop, his scope trained on a distant hatch 936 yards away. The target moved, a shadow in the crosswind, a threat to a pinned unit below. His finger rested on the trigger, his breath a metronome. One shot. The recoil was a pulse, the silence that followed a void. 12 lives taken in 5 minutes, each shot surgical, each one a weight added to his soul. He had slipped away before the unit could find him, before they could name him. That was his code. Act, vanish, carry the burden alone. Now, in the courtroom, that burden felt heavier, not because of the lives he had taken, but because of the life he could not explain. The gallery stirred, pulling John back to the present. A woman in the second row leaned toward her neighbor, her voice low but cutting. "He's got that look, you know. Like he's hiding something." Her neighbor nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Military guys like that. They never adjust." Their words were knives, small but precise, carving John into the shape of their fears. Judge Margaret Holt, seated at the bench, tapped her pen against a notepad, her face a mask of neutrality, but her eyes lingered on John, searching for something she could not name. She had seen cases like this, veterans caught in petty disputes, their pasts reduced to footnotes, but something about John's silence unsettled her, a quiet that felt less like guilt and more like resolve. The bailiff, Tom, stood near the door, his arms crossed, his discomfort growing. He had escorted John each day, had watched those gray eyes, steady and unyielding, and felt a prickle of unease, as if John saw through the room, through the town, to something deeper. Tom shifted his weight, his boots squeaking on the polished floor, and glanced at the clock. The jury would deliberate soon, the verdict a formality. He looked at John, expecting defeat, but found only calm, a man at peace with a fate he had already accepted. Outside, the veterans stood in a loose semicircle, their silence a mirror to John's. They were older now, their hair gray, their hands scarred, but their eyes burned with the clarity of shared history. One, a man named Carl, had served with John in the Marines, had seen his precision, his sacrifice. Carl's phone buzzed, a message from another vet. Heard it's bad. They're railroading him. Carl's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. They had not seen John in years, had not known he lived in Edenville until the news broke, but they knew him. They knew the man who never spoke of his medals, who walked away from glory. They were here to bear witness, to stand for a man who would not stand for himself. In the courtroom, Reese rose, his closing statement ready, but Judge Holt raised a hand, her voice measured. "We'll recess for 15 minutes before closing arguments." The room exhaled, spectators stretching, reporters slipping out to check their feeds. John remained seated, his hands still, his eyes fixed on the window, where a hawk circled high above the town, its wings cutting through the haze. Sarah stood, her voice sharp. "John, this is your last chance. Say something, or they'll bury you." He looked at her, his gaze heavy, and said, "They already have." Sarah's face flushed, her frustration spilling over, but she turned away, unable to meet the weight of his words. The recess stretched on, the courthouse hallway filling with the clatter of footsteps and the murmur of voices. Reporters typed furiously, their posts lighting up social media. Edenville veteran trial nears end. Guilty verdict expected. A few locals snapped photos, their captions cruel. Old man thought he was tough. Unnoticed, the veterans moved closer to the steps, their presence a quiet storm gathering at the edge of the chaos. Carl checked his watch, his eyes scanning the lot, as if expecting something, someone. He did not know General William Carter was coming, did not know the man with 4 stars on his collar was already on his way, but he felt it, a shift in the air, a truth waiting to break. Miles away, a black SUV sped along the highway, its tires humming against the pavement. Inside, General William Carter sat rigid, his uniform crisp, his face set. He had heard of the trial by chance, a news clip that mentioned John Miller's name. The memory had hit him like a bullet. Fallujah, a crumbling wall, a sniper's shot that saved his life. Carter had spent years searching for John, years haunted by the debt he could not repay. Now he was here, his purpose absolute, his urgency a fire in his chest. The courthouse loomed on the horizon, a brick beacon in the haze, and Carter's hand tightened on the armrest, his resolve unbreakable. Back in the courtroom, the recess ended, the room filling once more. Reese stood, ready to seal John's fate, his voice already forming the words that would damn him. Judge Holt settled at the bench, her gavel poised. John sat, his silence a shield, his eyes on the hawk still circling outside, a symbol of freedom he no longer sought. The trial was a machine grinding toward its end, but beyond the walls, a storm was gathering. Veterans, a general, a truth no one could ignore, and in that moment, John Miller, the man who had never asked for recognition, stood on the edge of a reckoning he could not foresee. The Edenville courthouse thrummed with the restless energy of a trial nearing its end, the air thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting stark shadows across the room, where John Miller sat at the defense table, his gray eyes fixed on nothing, his hands folded with a stillness that seemed to defy the chaos around him. The jury, their faces etched with the weight of their impending decision, scribbled final notes, their pencils scratching like whispers in the quiet. Outside, the June sun hung low, painting the windows in hues of amber and gold, but inside, the atmosphere was cold, clinical, a machine grinding toward judgment. David Reese, the prosecutor, stood before the jury, his closing statement poised on his lips, each word honed to seal John's fate. His suit was immaculate, his confidence a polished shield, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, as if he sensed the room was not entirely his. Sarah Klein, the public defender, sat slumped beside John, her laptop closed, her resolve eroded by his silence. She had stopped trying to reach him, her frustration now a quiet resentment that hung between them like a fog. Judge Margaret Holt, perched at the bench, adjusted her glasses, her face a mask of impartiality, but her fingers twitched around her gavel, a sign of the tension she could not fully hide. The gallery murmured, spectators leaning forward, their whispers a chorus of condemnation. "He's done for," one said. "Should have spoken up," another replied. John's mind drifted, not to the courtroom, but to the woods beyond Edenville, to the trailer where he lived alone, its walls lined with memories he never shared. The creak of his porch at dawn, the scent of pine, the solitude that had become his refuge. He had chosen that life, not out of anger but necessity, a way to keep the ghosts of Fallujah at bay. Now, those ghosts were here, in the eyes of the jury, in the accusations that painted him as a threat. He did not fear their verdict. He feared what it meant, that the world he had fought for had no place for men like him. The bailiff, Tom, stood near the door, his arms crossed, his unease growing with each passing minute. He had watched John throughout the trial, had seen the calm in those grey eyes, and felt a prickle of doubt, as if he were guarding a man who carried secrets too heavy for this room. Tom glanced at the clock, its hands ticking toward the end of Reese's closing, when a sound broke the rhythm of the trial, a low rumble, faint but deliberate, from the parking lot outside. No one else noticed, their focus locked on Reese, but Tom's head turned, his instincts sharpened by years on the job. Beyond the courthouse walls, a black SUV rolled to a stop, its tires crunching gravel, its presence a stark contrast to the dusty sedans and news vans scattered across the lot. The door opened, and General William Carter stepped out, his uniform crisp, the 4 silver stars on his collar glinting in the fading light. At 68, his face was lined but resolute, his posture unyielding, a man who commanded respect without a word. Reporters, caught off guard, scrambled for their cameras, their questions tumbling over one another. "Sir, are you with the defense?" one called. Carter did not answer, his eyes fixed on the courthouse, his purpose a fire that burned through the noise. He strode toward the steps, his boots striking the ground with measured precision, each step a declaration of intent. Inside, Reese began his closing, his voice rising, sharp, accusing. John Miller lives in the shadow of a past he can no longer claim. He thinks his service gives him the right to intimidate, to threaten. That's not heroism, ladies and gentlemen. That's danger. The jury leaned forward, their faces hardening, the weight of his words settling like dust. Judge Holt's gavel rested in her hand, ready to signal the end, when the courtroom doors swung open with a heavy creak. The sound was abrupt, jarring, and every head turned. The rhythm of the trial shattered. General Carter stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the amber light outside, his presence a force that filled the room. The gallery fell silent, their whispers dying mid-sentence. Reporters froze, their pens hovering, their cameras clicking softly. Reese paused, his mouth half open, his confidence faltering. Sarah Klein looked up, her eyes wide, her frustration giving way to confusion. Judge Holt rose from her bench, her glasses slipping down her nose, her voice steady but laced with surprise. "General, may I ask the purpose of your presence?" Carter did not answer immediately. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the polished floor, his eyes locked on John Miller. John, for the first time, lifted his head, his gray eyes meeting Carter's, a flicker of recognition passing between them, unspoken but profound. The room held its breath, the silence not awkward but reverent, as if the air itself had shifted to make way for something greater. Carter stopped before the defense table, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid but his gaze heavy with respect, with urgency, with a debt unpaid. "I am here," Carter said, his voice calm, clear, resonating through the room, "because this man sitting before you is the reason I am alive." The words landed like a thunderclap, sharp, undeniable. The jury stirred, their notebooks forgotten. Reese shifted, his hands gripping the table, his composure cracking. Sarah's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The gallery murmured, a low ripple of shock, but Carter raised a hand, and the room silenced, his authority absolute. John's face remained still, but his eyes held Carter's, a silent exchange that spoke of deserts and gunfire, of a moment 31 years ago when one shot had changed everything. Carter turned to the judge, his voice unwavering. "I heard of this trial by chance, and I could not stay silent. John Miller does not know I am here. He did not ask me to come. In fact, he would likely prefer I had not." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the jury, the spectators, the reporters. "But I owe him a truth this court has not heard." Reese opened his mouth to object, but the words died in his throat, his ambition no match for the weight of Carter's presence. Judge Holt leaned forward, her voice measured but curious. "General, are you requesting to testify?" Carter nodded once, his eyes returning to John. "With your permission, I would speak to the jury." Holt hesitated, her fingers tightening around her gavel, then nodded slowly. "Proceed, General." Carter stepped toward the jury box, his movements deliberate, his face composed but carrying something deeper. Not anger, not guilt, but a reverence that made the room feel small. The jurors watched him, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty, sensing they were on the edge of a revelation. John sat motionless, his hands still, but his breath caught, a subtle crack in his stoic facade. He had not wanted this, had not sought recognition, but Carter's presence was a tide he could not turn back. Outside, the veterans in the parking lot stood straighter, their eyes on the courthouse as if they felt the shift within its walls. Reporters crowded the steps, their cameras rolling, their posts already lighting up social media. Four-star general enters Edenville trial. Who is John Miller? The town of Edenville, unaware, stood on the brink of a reckoning, its assumptions about a silent old man unraveling with each step Carter took. And in the courtroom, the truth waited, a storm ready to break, its first gusts already stirring the air. The Edenville courthouse stood frozen, its air charged with the weight of General William Carter's presence. The fluorescent lights hummed, their pale glow casting stark shadows across the wooden benches, where spectators sat rigid, their whispers silenced by the gravity of the moment. John Miller remained at the defense table, his gray eyes locked on Carter, a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or resignation, breaking through his stoic mask. The jury, their notebooks forgotten, leaned forward, their faces a mix of awe and uncertainty, as if sensing the trial had shifted into something far greater than a misdemeanor. Outside, the June dusk settled over the town, the sky a bruise of purple and gold, but inside, time seemed to pause, the room holding its breath. General Carter stood before the jury box, his uniform crisp, the 4 silver stars on his collar glinting like beacons. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, resonant, each word a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the courtroom. 31 years ago, outside Fallujah, I was a young officer pinned behind a crumbling wall. My unit was scattered, communications down, 2 of my men wounded, bleeding out. He paused, his eyes sweeping the jury, drawing them into the memory. We were surrounded, out of options, out of time. And then, from nowhere, a single sniper cut a path through the chaos. The jurors' eyes widened, their breaths shallow. David Reese, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of his table, his confidence unraveling. Sarah Klein, the public defender, sat frozen, her pen hovering over her notepad, her earlier frustration replaced by a dawning realization. Judge Margaret Holt leaned forward, her gavel forgotten, her face etched with a mix of curiosity and reverence. The gallery was silent, the reporters' cameras clicking softly, capturing a moment that felt less like a trial and more like a reckoning. Carter's voice grew vivid, painting the scene with sensory precision. The air was thick with dust, the heat a living thing pressing against us. Bullets tore through the wall, each one closer, each one a promise of death. And then silence. One shot, then another, each one precise, surgical. 12 confirmed kills in under 5 minutes. He turned, his eyes finding John, his voice softening but unwavering. The last shot was through a rooftop hatch, 936 yards away, moving target, crosswind. That shot saved my life and the lives of the men with me. A murmur broke out, a low wave of shock rippling through the gallery, but Carter raised a hand and the room fell silent again. "That sniper," he said, his voice cutting through the tension, "was Gunnery Sergeant John Miller." The words landed like a thunderclap, sharp, undeniable. The jurors gasped, one dropping her pencil, another covering her mouth. Reese's face paled, his ambition crumbling under the weight of a truth he could not counter. Sarah's eyes darted to John, her resentment giving way to shame, her hands trembling as she realized the man she had dismissed was a hero. John's face remained still, but his breath caught, a subtle crack in his armor. He had not wanted this, had not sought the spotlight, but Carter's words were a tide pulling him back to a past he had buried. The memory flooded him. Fallujah, the weight of his rifle, the scope's crosshairs steady, the recoil a heartbeat. He had not spoken then, had slipped away before the unit could find him, before they could thank him. He had carried that moment alone, its weight heavier than any medal. Now it was here, in this courtroom, laid bare before strangers who had judged him without knowing. Carter stepped closer to the jury, his voice firm but laced with emotion. I have read the testimony. I have seen the charges. And I am telling you now, whatever words John Miller allegedly said in a parking lot, he has earned the right to be heard in a way none of you can measure. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the spectators, the reporters, the judge. He does not talk much, he never did. He did not come back from war looking for parades or praise. But if you think for a second that the man sitting here is a threat, you have no idea what restraint looks like. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling like dust. Judge Holt's hand rested on her gavel, her eyes glistening, her impartiality shaken. Reese opened his mouth to object, but the words died, his authority dwarfed by Carter's presence. The bailiff, Tom, stood straighter, his unease replaced by a quiet respect, as if he finally understood the man he had guarded. The veterans outside, still gathered in the parking lot, felt the shift, though they could not hear the words. Their leader, Carl, checked his phone, a news alert flashing. General testifies in Edenville trial. Sniper hero revealed. Carter turned to John, his face composed but heavy with something deeper, not guilt, not obligation, but a reverence born of shared sacrifice. He stepped toward the defense table, the room watching, breathless. Then, in a gesture that stunned the courtroom, Carter dropped to one knee before John, his head bowed, his hands clasped. The act was not weakness, not theatrics, but an apology, not for himself, but for a world that had forgotten who John Miller was. The silence was absolute, the air thick with awe, with shame, with something sacred. A juror wiped a tear, her notepad forgotten. Another looked down, his hands clenched, his earlier judgment now a weight he could not bear. Sarah's breath hitched, her eyes fixed on Carter, her failure as John's defender laid bare. Reese sank into his chair, his face flushed, his case collapsing under the truth. Judge Holt's hand covered her mouth, her gavel trembling in her grip, her voice lost to the moment. The reporters' cameras clicked, their lenses capturing a scene that would light up screens across the country. A four-star general kneeling before a man in worn boots and a plain shirt. John did not react at first, his gaze fixed on Carter, his eyes heavy with a lifetime of unspoken burdens. The room waited, the tension a living thing, as if the world hinged on his response. Finally, John rose, slow, deliberate, his boots scuffing the floor. He extended a hand, calloused and steady, to Carter. The general stood, taking it, and for a moment the two men faced each other, not as officer and sniper, not as witness and defendant, but as soldiers bound by a bond the room could never fully grasp. Their handshake was brief, but its weight was seismic, a silent vow that echoed through the silence. The gallery stirred, whispers breaking the spell. But they were different now. Not judgment, but awe, regret, a dawning respect. The veterans outside stood taller, their eyes on the courthouse, sensing the tide had turned. Reporters typed furiously, their posts already viral. Hero sniper, vindicated. General, kneels in courtroom. Judge Holt cleared her throat, her voice breaking slightly, but she did not speak, not yet. The moment was too vast, too raw, its truth still settling over the room like a storm's aftermath. John sat, his face unchanged, but his shoulders were lighter, as if a burden had shifted, not lifted, but shared. Carter stepped back, his testimony complete, his purpose fulfilled. The jury watched him, their faces transformed, their verdict no longer a formality. The trial was not over, but its heart had changed, its narrative rewritten by a truth no one could deny. And in that moment, John Miller, the man who had never asked for recognition, stood at the center of a story that would not be forgotten. The Edenville courthouse exhaled, its air still charged with the reverberation of General William Carter's testimony, the echo of his kneeling before John Miller lingering like a sacred chord. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the wooden benches, where spectators sat in stunned silence, their earlier judgments replaced by a quiet reverence. John Miller remained at the defense table, his gray eyes steady, his hands folded, the faint red marks on his wrists a reminder of the cuffs now gone. The jury, their faces softened by awe and shame, clutched their notepads, the weight of Carter's words reshaping their verdict before it was even spoken. Outside, the June dusk deepened, the sky a canvas of indigo streaked with fading gold, the town unaware of the seismic shift within its brick heart. Judge Margaret Holt sat at the bench, her gavel resting in her hand, her glasses reflecting the dim light as she struggled to reclaim the room's rhythm. Her voice, when it came, was measured but laced with emotion, a crack in her usual composure. In light of General Carter's testimony and the extraordinary context brought before this court, I am compelled to act. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the jury, the gallery, the reporters whose cameras still clicked softly. The charges against John Miller are dismissed, effective immediately. Her gavel came down, not with force but with finality, its sharp rap cutting through the silence like a blade. A murmur rippled through the gallery, not of protest, but of relief, of recognition, a collective exhale from a room that had misjudged a man. David Reese, the prosecutor, sank deeper into his chair, his face flushed, his ambition buried under the rubble of a case now lost. Sarah Klein, the public defender, stared at her hands, her earlier frustration replaced by a quiet guilt, her failure to see John's truth, a weight she would carry long after the trial. The bailiff, Tom, stood straighter, his unease gone, his eyes on John with a respect he could not articulate. The veterans outside, gathered in the parking lot, felt the shift, their leader Carl nodding to the others, a silent acknowledgement that justice, for once, had prevailed. John rose slowly, his boots scuffing the polished floor, his posture unyielding but his shoulders lighter, as if a burden had been shared, not erased. The bailiff approached, not to restrain but to guide, his touch gentle, almost reverent, as he led John toward the aisle. The jury watched, one woman wiping a tear, another clasping her hands, their earlier certainty now a memory. General Carter stood near the defense table, his face composed but his eyes heavy with relief, with gratitude, with a debt finally acknowledged. He nodded once to John, a gesture small but profound, a soldier's vow fulfilled. The courtroom doors opened, and John stepped into the hallway, the air cooler, tinged with the scent of wax and distant rain. Reporters surged forward, their cameras flashing, their questions tumbling over one another. "Mr. Miller, what do you say to the General's testimony?" one called. "Are you a hero?" another pressed. John did not answer, his gaze fixed ahead, his steps measured, as if the noise were a wind he could walk through. The crowd parted, their voices fading, their lenses capturing a man who seemed both present and elsewhere, a figure carved from silence and sacrifice. Outside, The courthouse steps glowed under the soft light of street lamps. The parking lot now a sea of shadows and flickering camera lights. The veterans stood at attention, their faces weathered but resolute, their eyes on John as he emerged. Carl, their leader, stepped forward, his hand rising in a salute, crisp, deliberate, a gesture echoed by the others. John paused, his gray eyes meeting theirs, and for a moment the years fell away. Fallujah, the desert, the shared weight of a war that had never truly ended. He nodded, a single, subtle motion, then continued down the steps, his boots striking the stone with a rhythm that echoed in the quiet. General Carter followed, not as an escort but as a witness, his presence a quiet anchor. At the base of the steps he stopped, turning to John, his voice low, steady. "I should have found you sooner." The words were not an apology, but a confession, heavy with the years they had both carried. John met his gaze, his face still, but his eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You did enough," he said, his voice gravelly, the first words he had spoken since the trial began. Carter's lips twitched, not a smile but a release, and he extended a hand. John took it, their grip brief but firm, a bond sealed in the dusk. The reporters hovered, their cameras rolling, but their questions went unanswered, their frenzy muted by the weight of the moment. Social media lit up, posts spreading like wildfire. Edenville sniper hero freed. General's testimony stuns court. Locals lingered at the lot's edge, their earlier gossip now a memory, their faces marked by a quiet shame. One woman, who had whispered about John's crazy eyes, stood silent, her arms crossed, her gaze on the ground. Another, who had called him a threat, slipped away, her coffee cup forgotten on a bench. John walked toward his truck, parked at the lot's far end, its faded blue paint a contrast to the sleek news vans. He did not rush, did not linger, his steps a metronome, each one a reclaiming of the solitude he had chosen. Carter watched him go, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mix of relief and resolve. The veterans dispersed, their mission complete, their salutes a silent vow to carry John's story forward. The courthouse stood behind them, its brick facade glowing in the dusk, a relic now tied to a truth it had nearly buried. In the days to come, Edenville would talk, not of John's silence, but of his sacrifice, of a general who knelt, of a trial that became a mirror for a town's failings. But for now, John climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life, the sound a low growl in the quiet. He drove toward the woods, toward the trailer that waited, its porch creaking, its walls holding the ghosts he would always carry. The town faded behind him, its lights blurring into the night, but the weight of the day remained, not as a burden, but as a truth finally spoken. The stars emerged, sharp against the indigo sky, and John's truck rolled on, its tires humming against the pavement. He did not need the verdict to tell him who he was, but for once the world had paused to see it. And in that pause, in the reverence of a general's knee, in the salutes of men who knew, John Miller found not vindication, but peace, a quiet, hard-won peace that would carry him home. The woods at Edenville's edge stood silent, their pine-scented shadows swallowing the last traces of dusk, as John Miller's truck rumbled down the narrow dirt road. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating gnarled branches and the faint glint of dew on the grass. His trailer came into view, a modest rectangle of weathered aluminum, tucked against a stand of oaks, its windows dark, its porch sagging under the weight of years. John parked, the engine's growl fading to a low hum, then silence. He stepped out, his boots crunching gravel, the air cool and heavy with the promise of rain. At 66, his movements were deliberate, each step a testament to a life measured in discipline, in burdens carried alone. Inside, the trailer was spare, its walls unadorned, save for a single shelf holding a folded flag, and a tarnished Marine Corps insignia. The scent of coffee grounds and old wood lingered, a quiet comfort. John lit a kerosene lamp, its soft glow casting flickering shadows across the room. He sat at a small table, his hands resting on its scarred surface, his grey eyes tracing the grain as if it held the map of his past. The trial, the courtroom, General Carter's testimony. They felt distant now, like a storm that had passed, leaving only echoes. He had not sought recognition, had not wanted the weight of eyes upon him, but the day had shifted something, a subtle lightening of the load he had carried since Fallujah. Outside, the night hummed with cicadas, their chorus a steady pulse against the quiet. John's thoughts drifted to the courthouse, to the moment Carter knelt, to the veterans' salutes, to the judge's gavel falling with finality. He had seen the town's faces change, spectators who had whispered crazy, now silent, reporters who had chased headlines now grappling with a truth they could not spin. Edenville would not forget, not soon. They would talk of John Miller, not as the old man in the woods, but as the sniper who saved lives, the hero who walked away from glory. But John did not need their stories. He had his own, written in the silence he had chosen, in the ghosts he had learned to carry. The town, too, was changing. At the diner on Main Street, where gossip had once painted John as a threat, locals now spoke in hushed tones, their coffee cups cooling as they recounted the trial. "Never would have guessed," one said, shaking his head. "Man like that, living right here, and we didn't know." Another, the woman who had sneered at John's silence, sat quietly, her eyes on the window, her earlier words a weight she could not shake. The gas station clerk, Lily Harper, had taken down the news article she had pinned to the bulletin board, replacing it with a photo of John leaving the courthouse, his head high, his steps steady. Even Ethan Cole, the man who had accused him, avoided the station now, his neck brace gone, his bravado replaced by a quiet shame. At the courthouse, Judge Margaret Holt lingered in her chambers, her robes folded, her desk cluttered with files. She had presided over countless cases, but John stayed with her, a reminder of how close justice had come to failing. She had written a letter to the local paper, not yet sent, urging the town to honor its veterans, to see beyond assumptions. David Reese, the prosecutor, had left for a new job in the city, his ambition intact but his confidence shaken, the memory of Carter's testimony a shadow he could not outrun. Sarah Klein, the public defender, had begun volunteering at a veterans center, her failure to defend John a spur to do better, to listen where she had once dismissed. The veterans who had stood outside the courthouse had not dispersed into silence. Carl, their leader, had organized a quiet gathering at the VFW hall, where they toasted John with cheap beer and stories of their own. Missions, sacrifices, the weight of coming home. They had sent John a letter, handwritten, inviting him to join them, but they knew he would not come. That was John, the man who acted, then vanished, who carried his honor in silence. They respected it, admired it, and vowed to keep his story alive, a beacon for others who walked the same quiet path. General William Carter had returned to his home in Virginia, but John's face stayed with him, a reminder of a debt he could never fully repay. He had begun writing a memoir, its first chapter dedicated to Fallujah, to the sniper who saved his life. He had sent John a copy of the draft, no expectation of a reply, but a hope that the words would matter. In the margins he had written, "You were never forgotten." John had read it late at night, the lamp's glow soft on the pages. He had set it aside, not out of dismissal, but because some truths did not need words to endure. John rose from the table, his chair scraping the floor, and stepped onto the porch. The night was vast, the stars sharp against the indigo sky, each one a pinprick of light in the dark. He leaned against the railing, the wood cool under his hands, and breathed deeply. the scent of pine and earth grounding him. His routine would not change. Dawn walks, measured steps, the solitude that was both refuge and burden. But the world had shifted, however slightly. Edenville saw him now, not as a ghost, but as a man, a hero who had never asked to be called one. That was enough. He thought of Fallujah, of the rooftop hatch, the crosswind, the shot that saved lives. He thought of Carter's knee on the courtroom floor, of the veterans' salutes, of the town's quiet reckoning. These were not victories, not in the way the world measured them. They were moments, fleeting but real, when silence became strength, when sacrifice was seen. John did not need medals or parades. He needed only this: the night, the woods, the knowledge that he had done what was right, even when no one watched. The cicadas sang on, their rhythm a heartbeat in the dark. John stepped back inside, the door creaking shut, the lamp's glow a soft anchor. He would rise at dawn, walk the woods, live as he always had, quietly, deliberately, carrying his scars with a grace most would never understand. But for once the world had paused to see it, and in that pause, John Miller, the silent hero, found a peace that would carry him forward. Edenville slept, its lights dim, its streets empty. But the story of John Miller lived on, not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the hearts of those who had seen him truly. It was a lesson, not of glory, but of recognition, of honoring the quiet greatness that walks among us, unseen until the moment it can no longer be ignored. And in the woods, under the vast and silent sky, John Miller carried on, unchanged, unbroken, a man who had never needed the world's verdict to know who he was. Police arrested a Navy SEAL in uniform. Then, a U.S. Admiral walked in and saluted him.